A heated exchange erupted in the first-class cabin of a luxury airline. The flight attendant stood with her arms crossed, her voice dripping with condescension, as she confronted a black woman seated near the window. "Are you sure you belong here?" she asked loudly, her words cutting through the hushed whispers of nearby passengers. The woman calmly looked up, her composed demeanor unshaken by the blatant insult. Instead of escalating, she simply said, "Check my ticket." But the flight attendant wasn't done. She smirked, as if convinced the woman didn't belong, and made a show of her authority in front of everyone. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, some murmuring in disbelief. But as the tension thickened, no one could have predicted what was about to happen. The truth was about to come out, and it would leave the entire cabin speechless. Where are you watching from today? Comment below, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful and inspiring stories. The flight from New York to Paris was one of the most luxurious experiences money could buy. In first class, everything was designed to make passengers feel important. The seats were large and comfortable, giving travelers plenty of space to relax. The dim lighting created a calm and peaceful atmosphere, and the flight attendants worked quickly, making sure everyone was well taken care of. Drinks were served in crystal glasses, and the food was prepared like a fancy meal at a top restaurant. Among the passengers was a black woman who carried herself with quiet confidence. Her posture was straight, and her movements were graceful. She wore an elegant outfit, and even though she wasn't trying to attract attention, people couldn't help but notice her. She sat calmly, reviewing important notes on her tablet. Her mind focused on the business meeting waiting for her in Paris. She wasn't here to show off or prove anything. She was just trying to prepare for her responsibilities. Her expression was calm, but she had noticed certain things. The way some passengers looked at her a bit longer than necessary. The way the flight attendants were extra polite to some people, but not as warm toward her. She had experienced things like this before, and knew exactly what it was. She didn't let it bother her because she had learned to deal with these moments with grace and patience. One of the flight attendants, however, seemed especially unfriendly. She glanced at the woman with a judgmental look and made assumptions about her. The flight attendant's expression wasn't subtle. It said, "You don't belong here," without needing any words. As she walked by, she made a comment under her breath, something like, "Some people don't know their place." The words were quiet, but loud enough for the woman to hear. The woman didn't react. She stayed calm, as if the comment didn't bother her. She didn't look up or say anything. She simply continued working on her notes. Her quiet confidence made it clear that she didn't need to defend herself. Meanwhile, the flight attendant, feeling certain she was right, continued about her work, giving warm smiles and excellent service to the other passengers. She didn't treat the woman the same way. It wasn't blatant rudeness, but it was clear enough that others could notice. Other passengers in the cabin began to pick up on the tension. Some glanced at the black woman, curious but unsure of what to say. Others simply avoided looking, pretending not to notice anything at all. The flight attendant seemed completely unaware of how her behavior looked to others. She thought she was in control of the situation. What no one realized was that this quiet, composed woman wasn't just another passenger. She had a secret that would change everything. The flight attendant had no idea who she was dealing with, and the woman had no intention of explaining herself, at least not yet. The tension in the cabin grew heavier, and something about the way the woman remained calm hinted that this wasn't over. The flight would soon take a dramatic turn, and nothing would ever be the same again. The atmosphere in the first-class cabin grew heavier as the tension from earlier moments lingered. Passengers tried to focus on their own activities, but many couldn't help glancing toward the black woman, who sat calmly, quietly, working on her tablet. She remained composed despite the subtle judgment that had already been directed her way. One of the flight attendants approached her seat, her expression stern and her tone sharp. "Excuse me," she said loudly, drawing attention from nearby passengers. "I need to see your boarding pass." The black woman looked up, meeting the attendant's gaze with calm eyes. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice steady and polite. The flight attendant hesitated for a moment but then crossed her arms and said, "I just need to confirm that you're in the right seat. This section is for premium travelers." A quiet hush fell over the immediate area. Passengers shifted in their seats, some pretending not to listen, while others openly watched the interaction. The black woman, keeping her expression neutral, reached into her bag and pulled out her boarding pass. She handed it to the flight attendant without a word. The attendant glanced over the pass, her eyes scanning it as if expecting to find an error. After a few moments, she handed it back, her tone still laced with suspicion. "Well, it seems fine," she said reluctantly. "But you understand, we have to be thorough. This section is for passengers who have paid a significant premium." The black woman took her boarding pass and calmly returned it to her bag. She didn't respond, choosing instead to focus back on her tablet. But the flight attendant wasn't finished. She lingered, her expression still skeptical. "You know," the attendant began, her voice louder now, "sometimes people buy upgrades they can't really afford, just to sit here. It's important to make sure this section is reserved for those who belong." The comment hung in the air like an accusation. Several passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances, and a man seated nearby shifted awkwardly in his seat. The black woman paused, setting her tablet aside. She looked up at the flight attendant, her voice calm but firm. "I believe I've already shown you my ticket. Is there anything else you need from me?" The flight attendant blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the composed response. But instead of backing down, she pressed further. "It's just unusual," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "Most of our premium travelers have a certain look. You know what I mean." The black woman's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of something sharper flashing in her eyes. "No," she said, her voice steady and direct. "I don't know what you mean. Perhaps you should explain." Nearby passengers began whispering to one another. A few looked visibly uncomfortable, while others simply stared, unsure of what to do. The flight attendant, however, seemed unfazed by the growing attention. She tilted her head and waved a hand dismissively. "There's no need to make this into a big deal," she said curtly. "I'm just doing my job." The black woman leaned back slightly in her seat, her posture relaxed but her words pointed. "If you're just doing your job," she said evenly, "then perhaps your job should include treating all passengers with respect." The flight attendant's face reddened slightly at the remark, and she glanced around the cabin, aware that many people were now watching. Still, she refused to admit any fault. Instead, she said in a curt tone, "If you continue to cause a disturbance, I'll have no choice but to call security." The black woman didn't flinch. Her expression remained calm and composed as she replied, "Go ahead. Let's see where this goes." A heavy silence fell over the cabin. Passengers who had been pretending not to listen were now openly watching. Some appeared shocked, while others murmured among themselves. The tension was thick, and it was clear that the situation had escalated far beyond a simple misunderstanding. The flight attendant, clearly flustered, turned on her heel and walked briskly toward the front of the cabin, muttering under her breath. She glanced over her shoulder once, but the black woman didn't look up. She had already returned to her tablet, her focus unshaken despite the murmurs and stares from those around her. A few passengers exchanged quiet comments, their voices just loud enough to be heard. One woman whispered to her companion, "Can you believe the way she spoke to her? It's outrageous." Another man, seated across the aisle, shook his head and muttered, "Some people just don't know how to act." But most passengers remained silent, unwilling to involve themselves. The black woman, however, remained as poised as ever, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to the flight attendant's earlier hostility. She knew this was far from over, but she wasn't going to let the situation rattle her. She had dealt with moments like this before, and she had learned to let her actions speak louder than words. The tension in the cabin didn't fade as quickly as the flight attendant had hoped. Whispers continued, and the weight of the moment lingered. But the black woman stayed quiet, waiting patiently. She knew the truth, and soon enough everyone else would know it too. The tension in the cabin was palpable as the black woman continued sitting calmly in her seat, completely composed despite the obvious hostility she had faced earlier. Passengers whispered among themselves, unsure of what might happen next. The flight attendant, however, was far from finished. Her frustration was evident as she marched back down the aisle, her expression hardened and her voice louder than before. "Ma'am," she began, addressing the black woman in a tone dripping with condescension, "you've been causing a disturbance in this cabin. Your behavior is unacceptable, and we cannot tolerate this in first class." Passengers turned their heads, their curiosity and unease growing. The accusation was baseless, as the black woman had done nothing but sit quietly in her seat. Her calm demeanor had not faltered even once, and yet the flight attendant insisted on escalating the situation. The black woman looked up, her gaze steady and unwavering. Her voice was calm, yet firm. "I'm sitting here, quietly minding my business. How exactly am I causing a disturbance?" The flight attendant hesitated, but only briefly. Her eyes darted around the cabin before she said loudly, "You're making other passengers uncomfortable." She gestured vaguely toward the rest of the cabin, as if to imply that everyone agreed with her. Nearby passengers exchanged uneasy glances, but it was clear that the discomfort was not caused by the black woman. Instead, it stemmed from the flight attendant's increasingly aggressive behavior. A few passengers whispered to each other, their disapproval of the situation growing more obvious. The black woman leaned back slightly in her seat, her calm expression never wavering. "Let me make this clear," she said evenly. "This isn't about my behavior. This is about your assumptions." The flight attendant blinked, momentarily caught off guard. "Excuse me," she asked, her voice faltering slightly. "You heard me," the black woman continued. "You've made assumptions about me since the moment I boarded this flight. It's not about my ticket. It's about what you think someone like me should or shouldn't be doing in this seat." Her words cut through the cabin like a blade. Passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some whispering to one another, others staring silently. The weight of her statement hung heavy in the air, forcing everyone to confront what they had just witnessed. The flight attendant's face turned red, but she quickly masked her discomfort with anger. "That's not true," she said defensively. "I'm just doing my job." "No," the black woman replied calmly. "Doing your job would mean treating every passenger with respect. That's not what you've done here. From the moment you approached me, your tone, your words, and your actions have been anything but respectful." The cabin fell silent. Even those who had been pretending not to listen were now paying full attention. The truth in her words was undeniable, and the flight attendant's authority seemed to shrink under the scrutiny of the passengers. "This isn't the first time I've experienced something like this," the black woman continued, her voice steady and clear. "I've faced assumptions and prejudice my entire life, but instead of letting it define me, I've used it as motivation. It's taught me to work harder, to achieve more, And to prove that no one else's bias can determine my worth. Her words resonated deeply, and for a moment, the cabin was filled with nothing but silence. The passengers seemed to hang on every word, their expressions a mix of shame, admiration, and reflection. The flight attendant, however, refused to back down. "If you continue to create problems," she said, her voice rising again, "I'll have to call security." The black woman met her gaze steadily, her expression calm. "Go ahead," she said. "Call security. Let's see where this goes." A murmur rippled through the cabin as passengers exchanged glances. The flight attendant hesitated for a moment before storming off toward the front of the plane, her frustration evident in every step. Minutes later, 2 security officers entered the cabin, their expressions serious as they approached the black woman. Before they could say anything, the co-pilot appeared from the cockpit, his eyes scanning the scene. His gaze landed on the black woman, and his expression immediately shifted to one of recognition and respect. "Ma'am," he said, addressing her directly, "is everything all right here?" The cabin fell silent once again, the weight of his words settling over everyone. It was clear from his tone that he knew exactly who she was. The flight attendant froze, her confidence crumbling as she realized something was wrong. She's causing a disturbance," she stammered, gesturing toward the black woman. "I was just trying to—" The co-pilot interrupted her, his tone firm. "Do you know who you're speaking to?" he asked, his eyes narrowing slightly. The flight attendant blinked, her mouth opening and closing, as she struggled to form a response. No, I don't." The black woman stood slowly, her presence commanding the attention of everyone in the cabin. "Maybe it's time you learned who I really am," she said calmly, her voice carrying a quiet power that silenced even the whispers of the passengers. The flight attendant's face turned pale as the realization began to dawn on her. She had made a grave mistake, and it was clear that she understood it now. Passengers gasped as they pieced together the situation, their shock evident in their expressions. The co-pilot gestured to the security officers, who stepped back immediately. "There's no issue here," he said firmly. "This passenger is one of our most important clients." The flight attendant's knees seemed to give out slightly as the weight of the situation hit her. She stood frozen, unable to speak or move as the truth of her actions became undeniable. The black woman turned to face her, her expression calm but unyielding. "Respect should be given to every passenger, not just the ones you think are important," she said. "I hope this is a lesson you won't forget." The cabin was silent as she returned to her seat, her composure unbroken. Passengers watched in awe, their admiration clear. The ripple effect of her words was evident. Some looked ashamed, others inspired. But no one would leave this flight unchanged. The flight attendant remained standing, her face pale, and her confidence shattered. She had learned a lesson that day, one she would carry with her for the rest of her life. The cabin slowly began to settle, but the impact of what had just happened would linger far beyond the end of the flight. The cabin remained silent as passengers stared at the black woman, who had just calmly but firmly reminded the flight attendant about the importance of respect for all passengers. The co-pilot's intervention had shifted the tone completely, leaving everyone unsure of what would happen next. The flight attendant stood frozen, her expression one of confusion and mounting regret. The black woman stood once more, her calm yet authoritative demeanor commanding the attention of everyone in the room. She took a step forward, her voice carrying across the cabin with clarity and poise. "Since there seems to be confusion about my presence here, let me clear things up." Reaching into her bag, she pulled out a sleek, black leather case and opened it. Inside was a set of credentials that bore her name and a logo that everyone immediately recognized. The logo of the airline itself. She held it up for all to see. "I am the CEO and owner of this airline," she said, her voice calm but firm. Gasps rippled through the cabin as the weight of her words sank in. Passengers leaned forward in their seats, their expressions ranging from shock to disbelief. The flight attendant, who had been standing stiffly just moments before, looked as though the ground had been pulled out from under her. Her face turned pale, and her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The black woman continued, her composure unwavering. "This airline was built with a purpose," she said, addressing not just the flight attendant but the entire cabin. "It was built to challenge the stereotypes and biases that so many people like me have faced. It was built to create a space where everyone is treated with dignity and respect, regardless of who they are, where they come from, or what they look like." She paused, letting her words sink in. The silence in the cabin was heavy, but it was clear that every passenger was hanging on to her every word. "I've worked my entire life to get to this point," she continued, her tone growing more personal. "I've faced countless moments like this, moments where I was judged not for who I am, but for how I look. And instead of letting those moments define me, I use them as fuel to build something better. That's why this airline exists." The passengers listened intently, many nodding along in agreement. The flight attendant, however, stood frozen in place, her eyes wide as the realization of her mistake washed over her. She had spent the entire flight treating the black woman as though she didn't belong, only to discover that she was speaking to the very person who owned the company. The black woman turned to her, her gaze steady, but not unkind. "It's not about what you said to me," she said softly. "It's about what your words represent. They're part of a much bigger problem, a problem that I've spent my life trying to fix." The flight attendant's eyes filled with tears, and she looked down, unable to meet the black woman's gaze. I'm so sorry," she stammered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't know." "That's the point," the black woman replied, her tone firm but measured. "You didn't know, and yet you made assumptions. Those assumptions affect how people are treated every day, not just here on this flight, but everywhere. It's a systemic issue, and it's something we all need to address." The flight attendant nodded slowly, her regret evident in every movement. "I realize now how wrong I was," she said, her voice trembling. "I let my own biases cloud my judgment, and I treated you unfairly. I'm so sorry." The black woman took a deep breath, her expression softening slightly. "Apologies are a start," she said, "but actions matter more. I'm not here to punish you, but I do want to make sure this doesn't happen again." Turning to the co-pilot, she said, "I want this flight attendant to undergo mandatory diversity and inclusion training, not as a punishment but as an opportunity to learn and grow." The co-pilot nodded immediately. "Of course, ma'am. I'll ensure it happens." The black woman looked back at the flight attendant, her gaze steady. "This isn't about making you feel small," she said. "It's about making sure you understand the impact of your actions. Everyone deserves respect, whether they own the airline or not." The flight attendant nodded again, her tears spilling over. "Thank you," she said quietly. "I promise I'll do better." The black woman gave a small nod before turning to the rest of the cabin. "This moment isn't just about me," she said, addressing the passengers. "It's about all of us. Every single one of us has a role to play in creating a world where respect and dignity are given to everyone, no matter who they are. It starts with small actions, like treating each other with kindness." The passengers erupted into applause, their admiration and support clear. The black woman returned to her seat, her composure unbroken. The flight attendant, meanwhile, remained standing, clearly humbled by the experience. As the cabin settled down, the ripple effect of the moment was undeniable. Passengers whispered to each other, sharing their thoughts on what they had just witnessed. Some reflected on their own biases, while others expressed admiration for the black woman's grace and strength. The flight attendant, though shaken, seemed genuinely reflective. She approached the black woman's seat cautiously, her voice soft. "Thank you," she said, "for teaching me a lesson I'll never forget." The black woman gave her a small, understanding smile. "The real lesson," she said, "is how you use what you've learned moving forward. Make sure it counts." The flight attendant nodded and walked away, her expression thoughtful. The cabin returned to a calm state, but the impact of the moment lingered in the air. For the rest of the flight, the black woman focused on her work, knowing that she had made a difference, not just for herself, but for everyone watching. She had turned a moment of bias into an opportunity for change, proving once again that respect and dignity were worth fighting for. The cabin was still buzzing with quiet conversations as passengers processed what had just happened. The black woman, now revealed to be the CEO and owner of the airline, had returned to her seat. Her poise and calm authority had left a lasting impression on everyone, and the tension that once filled the air had been replaced by an air of reflection and admiration. The flight attendant, still visibly shaken, stood at the front of the cabin, unsure of what to do next. Her mind raced with the weight of her actions and their consequences. Slowly, she walked back down the aisle toward the black woman, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. When she reached the seat, she hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Not just for giving me a second chance, but for showing me how wrong I was. I've realized that my assumptions hurt people, and I'm truly sorry." The black woman looked up at her, her expression kind but firm. "Acknowledging your mistake is the first step," she said gently. "But real change comes from understanding and learning. That's why I'm insisting you attend our mandatory diversity and inclusion training. It's not a punishment. It's an opportunity to grow." The flight attendant nodded quickly, tears welling up in her eyes. "I'll do it," she said. "I'll do whatever it takes to make sure this never happens again." Satisfied, the black woman gave her a small nod. "Good," she said. "Take what you've learned here and use it to make this airline and the world a better place." The flight attendant wiped her tears and walked back to her station, her posture more subdued, but also more thoughtful. The passengers who had been watching the interaction nodded approvingly, some even offering the woman encouraging smiles. As the flight continued, word of what had happened spread quickly. Passengers began to approach the black woman, not just to apologize on behalf of those who stayed silent earlier, but also to share their own experiences. One woman, seated a few rows back, leaned over and said softly, "I've been in your shoes. I've faced moments where people made assumptions about me, too. Seeing how you handled this with such grace, it's inspiring." A man seated nearby added, "You didn't just stand up for yourself. You stood up for all of us who've ever felt like we didn't belong." "Thank you." The black woman listened carefully to each story, offering kind words and encouragement. She could feel the ripple effect her actions were creating. It wasn't just about what had happened to her. It was about challenging a culture of bias and replacing it with understanding and respect. When the flight landed, the co-pilot escorted the black woman out of the cabin, ensuring her departure was as smooth as possible. A few passengers clapped quietly as she left, their way of showing gratitude for the lesson she had shared with everyone on board. By the next day, the incident had reached the airline's corporate office. The story of the flight had become a topic of discussion, not only within the company, but also among travelers and the general public. The black woman, as the CEO, decided to take swift and meaningful action. In a public statement, she addressed the incident head-on. Standing at a podium in front of a crowd of reporters, she spoke with the same calm authority she had displayed on the flight. What happened on that flight is a reminder that we still have work to do, she began. As the owner of this airline, it is my responsibility to ensure that every passenger and employee is treated with dignity and respect. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. Today, I'm announcing the launch of a new inclusivity policy. This policy will include mandatory training for all employees, with a focus on addressing unconscious bias and fostering an environment where everyone feels valued. Because respect isn't just a policy, it's a commitment. The statement was met with applause, and within hours, it began to make headlines. People across the world shared the story on social media, praising the black woman for her leadership and courage. The hashtag number #RespectTakesFlight began trending, with countless individuals sharing their own stories of facing prejudice and calling for systemic change. Back at the airline's headquarters, the flight attendant sat quietly in a training session, her notebook open in front of her. The experience on the flight had humbled her deeply, and she was determined to learn from her mistakes. She listened intently as the instructor spoke about the impact of unconscious bias, nodding along and taking notes. She had a long way to go, but she was committed to doing the work. Meanwhile, the black woman reflected on the journey that had brought her here. As she sat in her office, overlooking the city skyline, she thought about the countless challenges she had faced along the way. She remembered the moments of doubt, the unfair treatment, and the assumptions people had made about her. But she also remembered the victories, the times she had proven those assumptions wrong and had risen above the prejudice to create something extraordinary. Her thoughts returned to the flight. She hadn't planned for that moment to happen, but she was grateful that it had. It had been an opportunity to remind people of the importance of respect, empathy, and understanding. It was a reminder that even in the face of bias, there was always a chance to inspire change. With a quiet smile, she spoke softly to herself, echoing the words that had guided her throughout her journey. We rise by lifting others, even when it's hardest to. The words felt more true now than ever. She turned back to her work, knowing there was still much to be done. But this time, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. Change was happening, one small step at a time. The black woman sat in her office, reflecting on the journey that brought her to this moment. Her airline's new inclusivity policy was already making waves, and the story of the flight had sparked meaningful conversations around the world. She smiled to herself, knowing that the impact went far beyond her personal experience. It was about inspiring change in others and showing that even in difficult moments, there's always an opportunity to do better. As she turned back to her work, her voice carried a final thought, one that she hoped would resonate with everyone. It's not about what you've achieved, but how you inspire change in others. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful and inspiring stories. Your support helps us create content that makes a difference and brings important messages to light. Thank you for watching. Remember, your stories inspire the world, and together we can create a more understanding and inclusive future. See you in the next story.